I'm late to the party, but I'd like to discuss the linguistics of the opening match of the World Cup. As I was saying, the linguistics of the opening match of the World Cup. One of Mexico's defenders was him, and his surname provides us with an excellent opportunity to look at one of the more consistent features of Spanish historical phonology, the disappearance of word initial F. Of course, Fidalgo's surname bucks this trend, and we're going to be looking at potentially why. By a happy coincidence, his full name is Álvaro Fidalgo Fernández, which gives me twice the opportunity to talk about the matter at hand. Firstly, I'd like to point out that Fidalgo is not the usual Spanish rendering of this noun and this name. In Spanish, it's usually hidalgo. And superficially, the etymology seems quite simple. Hidalgo is an abbreviation of hijo de algo, literally meaning a son of something. But in this case, that algo refers to something of substance, something of worth. An hidalgo was usually the child of someone, often not of aristocratic origin, who had been raised to a level of social, political, economic, or even military prestige. Historically, both in Spain and in Portugal, this seems to be associated with the Reconquista. That is to say, that if someone was able to successfully defend and hold a position of strategic importance in the various battles and wars between the numerous polities on the Iberian Peninsula, they could be raised by the crown to a higher ranking in recognition of their efforts. As historically interesting as this might be, I fear that it's merely half an etymology. We should go all the way here and explain how Latin filius becomes Spanish hijo, in large part because this drives to the point of this whole video. Now, a lot of this process we've discussed before in a previous video, so I will link that if you want to go into a bit more depth here. Summarizing though, Latin had very strict syllabic distinction. So the Latin filius in classical Latin would have been pronounced as a trisyllabic word, filius. Over time, however, this strict syllabic distinction began to erode, and we would see that filius becomes the bisyllabic filius. That has implications for the vowel quality. That vowel in us is now more like a diphthong than two monophthongs next to each other. And this has implications, furthermore, for the articulation of the consonant, the lateral alveolar proximant l. The diphthong kind of dragged that l into palatalization, and that gives us that lovely sound we see in Portuguese filho or Italian figlio. And likely Spanish in its early stages also underwent this kind of palatalization, but Spanish quite early on palatalized this further into the fricative j. So, to recap, we move from filius to filius to perhaps something like filio and then to figlio. And from there, which seems to have been, with a very important caveat, the pronunciation evident in the 11th century Cantar del Mio Cid, we have two further important changes. The first is the change of that je. It gets velarized and becomes the modern Spanish sound represented by jota, if I may exaggerate it a bit, j. And then the other change, which probably happened sometime before, was the elimination of the F. So from figlio, we will get hijo. But I've dramatically simplified that down to account for a certain degree of discrepancy in the scholarship on this particular phonological change. If we look at modern Spanish vocabulary in general, the consistent trend follows what we've seen in filius, the debuccalization or disappearance of f to the silent h. And it's something that occurs in Spanish that didn't occur in most other Romance languages. This is why we have, to use the example in the beginning, hidalgo in Spanish, but fidalgo in Portuguese. Harina in Spanish, but farina in Italian for flour. Spanish has hacer, to do, but French has faire. Oven in Spanish is horno, in Portuguese forno, and so on and so forth. I will add as another caveat here that this debuccalization of F isn't absolute For reasons we're about to look into, whenever Spanish diphthongize the short stressed Latin o into we, as occurs with the Latin focus becoming Spanish fuego, Latin forte becoming Spanish fuerte, fuente as well fits into this pattern, we don't see this debuccalization. But enough with all the half explanations I've had to provide in this video. I want to look specifically at what this change is and how it came about. Why does Spanish debuccalize this Latin F? And it's precisely in Latin where the story gets interesting and convoluted. Firstly, it seems that Latin only inherited words with an F in them in word initial position. The way we see Latin words with F in the midst of the word, it's usually because that's either constructed from two different words. If you think about something like defectus in Latin, that comes from de and fectus, or they come from words that are inherited or adopted from other languages, such as filosofia, for example. And this is crucial because, you see, a lot of the time, those word initial Fs were before vowels. Obviously, there are examples like fructus, which don't fit the pattern. But by and large, we're looking at Latin words where the F precedes a vowel. And this is important because, as you can tell in English, word initial F preceding a vowel is pronounced much softer than we find it in other contexts. And we can test this out right now. Compare forever with if. You'll notice that the way we pronounce f in English, labiodental fricative, so called because the teeth make contact with the lips, it's much softer in forever as opposed to if. So this is crucial context for understanding Spanish debuccalization. Secondly, you'll notice that earlier on I specifically avoided linguistically, phonetically describing the Latin F sound because there's actually some dispute as to how Latin speakers pronounced their Fs historically. Rolf Penny, amongst other scholars, actually argues that it wasn't pronounced in classical Latin as a labiodental fricative, but actually pronounced more like a bilabial fricative. As a side point, this is kind of interesting because I've heard from Japanese speakers that when F is in word initial position in Japanese, that's actually how it's pronounced. So in Japanese, Mount Fuji wouldn't be Fuji, but something more like Fuji. So already we have two opinions on how F was pronounced in Latin in word initial context. To use our example from earlier, we have either filius or filius. Given the apparent fragility of this word initial F, it isn't surprising that Spanish would go in the direction of debuccalization, and it seems to have done so quite early. Even when the orthography doesn't explicitly demonstrate this, scholars like Paul Lloyd argue that often when we see F in word initial position in Old Spanish texts, that was likely already pronounced at very least as a bilabial fricative, and often not pronounced at all. This has some consequences for attempts to reconstruct works of Old Spanish like El Cantar del Mio Cid. If we look at the very first stanza of that epic poem, and we trust the works of scholars like Lloyd, we should pronounce this as Habló mio Cid e tan mesurado. But what this doesn't explain is why Spanish underwent debuccalization but the other Romance languages did. Clearly, the apparent weakness of word initial F in Latin wasn't enough to see it disappear in Italian, Portuguese, and French, not to mention a number of other Romance languages. I think what we first have to do here is recognize that actually complete debuccalization isn't an exclusively Spanish trend. From what I've looked up, it's actually present in areas of Romania and Moldova, and it's also present in Gascony, in the Gascon language. More on that later because that's crucial. If we want to look at why many of the other Romance languages preserved word initial F, one theory that I found particularly interesting is that they preserved it by analogy. As many of us know, language change often proceeds because speakers make associations between words and sounds that are not strictly genealogically related, if I may use that terminology. An interesting example I heard of recently on Jeff Lindsay's channel is how lots of speakers of Southern Standard British are starting to pronounce mischievous as mischievous because it's associated, it rhymes with devious. This is an example of change by analogy. And an analogy that late Latin and early Romance speakers might have lent on was that the Latin w sound, which was represented by v, actually pretty early on, like probably by the 2nd century AD, was starting to be fricativized. So it was actually being pronounced not merely as a vowel approximant w, but it started to become something like the modern v, proceeding first through almost an intermediary v sound. So it may be that Romance speakers in much of modern-day France, Italy, and parts of the Iberian Peninsula corresponding with modern Portugal almost reanalyzed this word initial Latin as the unvoiced labiodental fricative f, which is used today in those languages. I find that an interesting, exciting theory, but if you have any opposition to it, please let me know in the comments below. I'm keen to learn there. Back to Spanish. Now, the dominant theory right now seems to be that articulated by Ramón Menéndez Pidal over a century ago, when he posited that it's actually due to Basque influence and possibly Iberian influence, the language, not the geographical space. The speakers of these languages quite probably didn't have a labiodental or bilabial fricative sound in word initial position anyway. And so when they heard Latin speakers saying something like filius or filius, they just removed it as they started to adopt Latin. And I think actually the geography seems to back this up. Note what I was saying earlier about how debuccalization occurs in Gascon. A simple look on a map will indicate that Gascon corresponds with traditionally Basque territory. Additionally, the first attestations that we have, the first examples that we have that imply complete debuccalization in Spanish come from the Spanish center north, which correspond with exactly the language populations that Ramón Menéndez Pidal pins as the cause of this phenomenon. And so, in a nutshell, there we have 3 or so intersecting theories that explain why Spanish has this really interesting characteristic. But we need to get back to the beginning of this video. Why is this player from Mexico called Álvaro Fidalgo Fernández? Doesn't this seem to completely defeat a lot of what I've said in this video? Well, there are many answers that we can have recourse to. Firstly, in some places in Latin America, in Andalusia and in Extremadura, debuccalization hasn't completely occurred, and we still sometimes hear speakers pronounce what is usually a silent H in Spanish as a f. So that's count number 1. Count number 2 is that surnames are actually not easy. The idea that we have today that every single citizen of a country has a surname is a very post-Napoleonic phenomenon. Even up until pretty recently, not everyone in the modern nation state actually had a surname. And so often you'll find that people who previously were not entirely literate had to provide government bureaucrats with some surname. And for this reason, we often get a lot of non-standard orthography when it comes to registering surnames across the globe. What is more, sometimes when translating surnames from one language to another, a lot is lost phonologically in transcription. But thirdly, we can just look at the player himself. Now, not a lot of his biography is publicly available information, but interestingly enough, Álvaro Fidalgo actually wasn't born in Mexico. I was surprised to find this out. I always thought he was Mexican, but he only gained Mexican citizenship fairly recently after 5 years playing for Club de América in Mexico. He was actually born in Spain, and where he was born in Spain is relevant. He was born in Asturias, in a part of the north closely bordered by Portugal. That is, in a place where, even today, Galician is spoken alongside Castilian as an official language. And I wouldn't be surprised if lots of Spanish speakers there speak Spanish in a way that reflects this historical continuum with Galician Portuguese. It may be that the people there preserved or developed the labiodental F in their surnames. It could be that Álvaro's surname is the conservative form of the Spanish hidalgo. It would be best to think of more as an Asturian Galician name. That's my hypothesis about his surname. If you have more information, particularly about this, let me know in the comments below. As always, if I've made any glaring errors that haven't been corrected through editing, I'd also be grateful if you could point that out. I've done my best to research this, but there are always gaps. Finally, though, before I finish, and in reference to the skit I opened this video with, I'd like to wish all of my Mexican followers and subscribers the best during this World Cup. Mucha suerte a vosotros. Siempre he querido mucho visitar a México. Me gusta tanta, me encanta la cultura, la historia, la gente de vuestro país. Y sinceramente os deseo y deseo vuestro equipo lo mejor durante este mundial. On a related note, I've been looking at the demographic and geographical statistics on this channel, and it actually turns out that most of our viewers come from Brazil and Spain. It's pretty much tied between those two countries. And so for both of you, I'm really wishing your teams and your countries the best during this World Cup. I know things started out with a draw, but I'm hoping that this is just the prelude to something much greater. And finally, to my fellow South Africans, who constitute about the fifth or sixth largest base of subscribers, viewers, and followers here, don't take my opening skit too much to heart. That's it for now. I hope to see you all in the next video and in the comments below. Hasta la próxima. Adiós.